Welcome back to this quiet space of memory and time. Let the weight of the day leave your body. Let your breathing settle into a slow, natural rhythm. Tonight, we are going to explore the profound, dramatic, and deeply moving history of Finland during the Second World War. We will walk through the frozen forests, the vast lakes, and the heavy years of three distinct conflicts that tested the resolve of the Finnish nation. Let the steady, monotonous rhythm of the words calm your thoughts, leaving no room for daily worries, as we journey together into the quiet northern night. To understand the story of Finland in the Second World War, we must first look at the quiet years that came before. Finland was a young nation, having gained its independence from the Russian Empire in 1917. In the 2 decades that followed, the Finnish people worked tirelessly to build a democratic, peaceful society amidst a landscape of immense natural beauty. It was a land of over 60,000 lakes, endless pine forests, and harsh, beautiful winters. The people were deeply connected to the earth, quiet by nature, and possessed a unique cultural concept known as sisu, a word that translates to a mixture of stubborn determination, courage, and resilience in the face of impossible odds. As the late 1930s brought dark political clouds over the European continent, Finland, much like its Scandinavian neighbors, wished only to remain strictly neutral. The government believed that by posing no threat to any foreign power, they would be left alone to cultivate their fields and develop their towns. However, the geographic reality of Finland placed it directly in the path of imperial ambitions. To the east lay the massive Soviet Union, a superpower undergoing rapid industrialization and military growth. The Soviet leadership looked at the map with growing concern. The second largest city in the Soviet Union, Leningrad, was located just 32 kilometers from the Finnish border on the Karelian Isthmus. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, feared that a foreign power, specifically Nazi Germany, could use Finnish territory as a staging ground to launch a surprise attack against Leningrad. In the autumn of 1939, shortly after the outbreak of the war in Poland, the Soviet government summoned a Finnish delegation to Moscow. They presented a series of heavy demands. The Soviet Union demanded that the border on the Karelian Isthmus be pushed back several dozen kilometers to create a wider buffer zone around Leningrad. They also demanded the destruction of existing Finnish fortifications, the secession of several strategic islands in the Gulf of Finland, and the leasing of the Hanko Peninsula for 30 years so the Soviet Navy could construct a massive military base at the entrance to the Gulf. In exchange, the Soviet Union offered a large piece of territorial wilderness further north in Soviet Karelia. For the Finnish government, these demands presented a terrible dilemma. The territory the Soviets wanted on the Karelian Isthmus was not just empty land. It was home to more than 10% of the Finnish population, contained major agricultural and industrial centers, and held the primary defensive line of the nation, known as the Mannerheim Line. More importantly, the leadership felt that giving in to these demands would compromise the sovereignty and independence of the country, turning Finland into a mere puppet state. The Finnish delegation attempted to negotiate, offering smaller territorial concessions, but they refused to yield on the core demands. By late November, the talks in Moscow broke down completely, and the Finnish diplomats returned home, knowing that a dark storm was about to break. On the morning of November 30, 1939, without any formal declaration of war, the Soviet military launched a massive invasion of Finland. The silence of the winter morning was shattered as Soviet artillery began a heavy bombardment along the entire border, and Soviet bombers appeared in the grey skies above the capital city of Helsinki, dropping explosives on residential neighborhoods. The world looked on with shock and deep sympathy for the small northern nation. The scale of the conflict seemed completely lopsided. The Soviet Union possessed a population of over 170 million people and a military machine equipped with thousands of modern tanks, airplanes, and heavy artillery. Finland, by contrast, had a population of just under 4 million people. Its army was small, severely lacking in modern equipment, anti-tank weapons, and ammunition. Many Finnish soldiers had to report for duty wearing their own civilian clothes, given only a military belt, a cockade for their hat, and a rifle. The Soviet plan relied on a swift and overwhelming victory. They expected to crush the Finnish defenses within a matter of weeks, installing a puppet communist government that they had already prepared. Soviet troops advanced in massive columns along the Karelian Isthmus and through the dense forests further north, aiming to cut the country in half at its narrowest point near the town of Oulu. But the invaders had not accounted for two critical factors: the brutal reality of the northern winter and the unyielding spirit of sisu within the Finnish people. As December progressed, the weather turned exceptionally severe. Temperatures plummeted to -30 and sometimes even -40 degrees Celsius. The deep snow drifted through the endless forests, creating a landscape that was beautiful but deadly for an army unprepared for the Arctic environment. The Soviet soldiers, wearing thin uniforms and driving heavy vehicles that required constant engine maintenance to prevent freezing, found themselves trapped on the narrow logging roads that cut through the wilderness. The dense pine forests on either side of the roads became a wall of white silence, hiding an invisible and deadly enemy. The Finnish army, under the supreme command of the venerable Field Marshal Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, adopted tactics perfectly suited to their homeland. The soldiers were expert skiers, dressed in pristine white camouflage suits that made them completely invisible against the snow. They moved silently through the winter woods, carrying lightweight submachine guns and unique handmade knives called puukko. They utilized a tactic known as moti, a word derived from the measurement of firewood. Instead of confronting the massive Soviet armored columns head-on, the highly mobile Finnish ski troops would strike the columns from the flanks and rear, cutting the long lines of vehicles into smaller, isolated pockets. Once a motti was created, the Finnish forces would surround it, blocking all supply routes, and systematically neutralize the isolated units over days or weeks. The most famous example of these tactics occurred during the legendary Battle of Suomussalmi and the subsequent fighting on the Raete Road. In these remote northern forests, two entire Soviet divisions were completely surrounded and defeated by a much smaller Finnish force. The specialized ski units destroyed the enemy soup kitchens, supply trucks, and command posts, leaving the invading troops exposed to the terrifying, unforgiving cold. The victory at Suomussalmi shocked the international community and became a symbol of incredible resistance, proving that determination and local knowledge could overcome sheer numbers. It was during this bitter winter conflict that the Finnish soldiers invented a simple but highly effective weapon to combat the enemy tanks. Lacking standard anti-tank guns, they filled glass bottles with a volatile mixture of gasoline, kerosene, and tar, attaching a burning rag as a fuse. They named this homemade weapon the Molotov cocktail, a sarcastic tribute to the Soviet foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, who had claimed in radio broadcasts that Soviet bombers were not dropping explosives on Helsinki, but rather delivering food baskets to starving citizens. On the Karelian Isthmus, the main defensive line held firm through December and January. The Mannerheim Line, consisting of simple earthen trenches, granite anti-tank boulders, and a few concrete bunkers, resisted wave after wave of frontal assaults. The Finnish soldiers stood ground with immense bravery, earning the respect of military observers worldwide. In the skies, the tiny Finnish Air Force, flying a collection of outdated planes purchased from various nations, fought gallantly against overwhelming odds, while civilian populations learned to seek shelter in cellars and underground stations whenever the air raid sirens wailed. However, as February 1940 arrived, the sheer weight of the Soviet Empire began to tell. Realizing that the initial campaign had been a disaster, the Soviet leadership replaced their commanders and brought in massive reinforcements, including fresh divisions from Siberia who were accustomed to the cold. They amassed an overwhelming amount of heavy artillery along the Karelian Isthmus, launching a relentless, non-stop bombardment that pounded the Mannerheim Line day and night. The ground trembled for miles around, and the Finnish soldiers, exhausted by months of continuous fighting without rest or rotation, began to suffer from extreme fatigue and a critical shortage of ammunition. By early March, the outer defenses of the Mannerheim Line were breached. The Soviet forces advanced toward the historic city of Viipuri. Field Marshal Mannerheim informed the government that the military was reaching the absolute limit of its endurance, and that if the fighting continued much longer, the front might collapse entirely. The Western Allies, Britain and France, had offered to send an expeditionary force, but the logistical difficulties and the risk of violating the neutrality of Norway and Sweden meant that help would arrive too late. Faced with the harsh reality of national survival, the Finnish government made the painful choice to seek peace. On March 12, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed, bringing an immediate end to the Winter War after 105 days of intense conflict. The terms of the treaty were incredibly harsh. Finland was forced to cede 11% of its pre-war territory, including the entire Karelian Isthmus, the city of Viipuri, and large areas around Lake Ladoga. They also had to lease the Hanko Peninsula for use as a military base. The human cost was devastating. Over 25,000 Finnish soldiers had lost their lives, and over 40,000 were wounded. More than 400,000 citizens living in the ceded territories had to leave their homes, packing whatever belongings they could fit on sleds and carts, evacuating to the remaining parts of Finland to rebuild their lives from scratch. Not a single person chose to stay behind under Soviet rule. Yet, despite the loss of land, Finland had achieved something miraculous. They had preserved their independence, their democracy, and their honor. The country had not been conquered. The period that followed became known in Finnish history as the interim peace. It was a time of deep anxiety and intense preparation. The geopolitical landscape of Northern Europe was changing rapidly. In April 1940, Germany invaded and occupied Denmark and Norway, effectively cutting Finland off from the Western world. To the south, the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Finland found itself isolated, sandwiched between two brutal totalitarian empires, with its economy strained by the need to house and feed the hundreds of thousands of refugees from Karelia. The Finnish leadership feared that the Soviet Union would return to finish the job and absorb the rest of the country. Seeking security, Finland began to look for an ally. During the autumn of 1940, Germany, quietly preparing for its own massive invasion of the Soviet Union, approached the Finnish government. They offered military aid, trade agreements, and the return of the lost territories in exchange for cooperation. For Finland, this appeared to be the only viable option to guarantee national survival. A secret agreement was reached, allowing German troops to transit through northern Finland, and allowing the Finnish military to purchase much-needed modern weaponry. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Initially, Finland declared itself neutral in this new conflict, stating that it would only fight if attacked. However, 3 days later, on June 25, Soviet bombers launched heavy air raids against several Finnish cities and airfields. The Finnish government declared that the nation was once again at war. This second conflict became known as the Continuation War, as the Finnish people viewed it not as a part of Germany's global war, but as a separate, justified attempt to reclaim the lands taken from them during the Winter War. The atmosphere in the summer of 1941 was very different from the dark days of 1939. The Finnish army was now well equipped, well trained, and supported by a powerful ally. They launched a rapid counter-offensive, advancing swiftly across the old borders on the Karelian Isthmus and around Lake Ladoga. Within a few months, they had fully reclaimed the territories lost in the Winter War, allowing the displaced Karelian population to return to their ancestral farms and rebuild their homes. However, the Finnish leadership made a conscious decision to limit their participation in the wider war. When the German High Command pressured Field Marshal Mannerheim to join the assault on Leningrad and cut off the city's supply lines from the north, he firmly refused. The Finnish troops halted their advance at the old historical border on the isthmus, declining to cross into Soviet territory in that sector. Further north, however, Finnish forces did advance into Soviet East Karelia, occupying a large area to create a more defensible front line along the major lakes. By the end of 1941, the rapid movement of the front stabilized, and the war entered a long, exhausting phase known as the Trench War period. For 2.5 years, the front lines remained relatively quiet. Soldiers on both sides lived in elaborate networks of trenches, dugouts, and bunkers carved into the granite earth and rocky hills. Daily life became a monotonous routine of guard duty, maintenance, and small skirmishes. Back home, the civilian population endured the long years with quiet dignity, managing severe shortages of food, clothing, and labor, as the vast majority of young men were stationed at the distant front. During these long years of stalemate, the geopolitical tide began to turn once again. The German army suffered catastrophic defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, and it became increasingly clear that Germany would lose the war. The Finnish government realized they had tied their fate to a sinking ship, and they began making quiet, secret attempts to find a way out of the conflict through diplomatic channels, but the terms offered by the Soviet Union remained unacceptably high. The true crisis arrived in the summer of 1944. With the Western Allies landing in Normandy, the Soviet leadership launched a massive, coordinated offensive designed to knock Finland out of the war once and for all. On June 9, 1944, a terrifying artillery barrage began on the Karelian Isthmus. The Soviet military had gathered an immense force of soldiers, modern tanks, and aircraft, unleashing a storm of fire that surpassed anything seen before in the north. The Finnish defensive lines were shattered under the weight of the assault. The strategic city of Viipuri fell within days, and the Finnish army was forced into a rapid, desperate retreat. The situation was critical, mirroring the dark days of 1940. The country stood on the edge of complete collapse. Field Marshal Mannerheim appealed to Germany for emergency assistance. Germany agreed to send vital anti-tank weapons, including the highly effective Panzerfaust, and a specialized air support unit known as Detachment Kulmi, but they demanded a political price. The German leadership insisted on a formal declaration that Finland would not seek a separate peace. To save the nation without permanently binding its future, the president of Finland, Risto Ryti, made a profound personal sacrifice. He signed a personal letter to Adolf Hitler, known as the Ryti-Ribbentrop Agreement, stating that he, as president, would never make peace with the Soviet Union without German consent. This clever political maneuver secured the immediate delivery of German weapons and air support, allowing the Finnish military to stabilize the front. Equipped with the new anti-tank weapons and supported by the German aircraft, the Finnish army launched a monumental defensive effort in the late summer of 1944. The decisive clash took place at the Battle of Tali-Ihantala, the largest land battle ever fought in the history of the Nordic countries. In a narrow area of hills, lakes, and forests, the Finnish soldiers stood ground against overwhelming Soviet armor. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, with the air filled with the smoke of burning tanks and the roar of artillery. Through immense bravery and brilliant tactical coordination, the Finnish forces succeeded in halting the Soviet advance, inflicting heavy losses and forcing the Soviet command to realize that conquering the entire country would require too much time and resources they needed for the final march on Berlin. Having stabilized the front and stopped the immediate danger of conquest, President Ryti resigned from office, stating that his personal agreement with Hitler was no longer binding on the nation. The parliament immediately appointed the revered Field Marshal Mannerheim as the new president, granting him the authority to lead the country toward peace. On September 4, 1944, a ceasefire went into effect, bringing an end to the continuation war. The subsequent Moscow Armistice, signed on September 19, placed incredibly heavy burdens on Finland. They had to cede the same territories lost in 1940, along with the northern region of Petsamo, which completely cut Finland off from the Arctic Ocean. They were also forced to pay massive war reparations to the Soviet Union in the form of industrial goods over several years, and they had to lease the Porkala Peninsula, located just 30 kilometers from Helsinki, as a Soviet military base. But perhaps the most difficult and dangerous condition of the armistice was the requirement that Finland must immediately intern or expel all German military forces remaining on its soil. there were over 200,000 German soldiers stationed in the remote northern regions of Lapland, under the command of General Lothar Endulik. Initially, both sides attempted to organize a peaceful, quiet withdrawal of German troops toward Norway. However, pressured by the Soviet leadership who demanded faster action, the situation quickly degenerated into an open conflict known as the Lapland War. The final phase of Finland's wartime journey was a heartbreaking and tragic experience. The Finnish army, now consisting largely of young recruits as the older veterans were being demobilized under the terms of the peace treaty, had to fight against their former allies in the rugged, vast wilderness of the north. As the German forces retreated toward the Norwegian border, they adopted a total scorched earth policy, identical to the one they used in northern Norway. They were determined to leave nothing behind for the advancing Finnish troops. They systematically blew up every bridge, destroyed every railway line, and burned down almost every village, house, and barn in Lapland. The beautiful, historic capital of Lapland, Rovaniemi, was reduced to a landscape of smoking ruins and standing chimneys. More than 100,000 residents of Lapland had to be evacuated in a matter of weeks, fleeing to safety in the south or across the border into neutral Sweden. The fighting in the north lasted through the long autumn and winter months of 1944, moving slowly through the snow-covered fells and marshes. The final German soldiers crossed the border into occupied Norway on April 27, 1945. Only then, after more than 5 years of continuous struggle, was the territory of Finland completely free from foreign forces, and the war finally came to an end. The cost of these 3 conflicts was monumental for the small nation. Over 90,000 Finnish men had lost their lives, leaving behind thousands of widows and orphans. An entire generation bore the physical and emotional scars of the battles. The country had lost valuable lands, its infrastructure in the north was completely erased, and the economic burden of the war reparations seemed almost impossible to bear for a broken economy. Yet, as the peace settled over the deep forests, the endless lakes, and the quiet towns, the people of Finland could look to the future with hope. Against all historical probability, through the sheer power of sisu, unity, and sacrifice, they had achieved the ultimate victory, they had preserved their freedom. Unlike almost every other nation in Eastern and Central Europe that bordered the Soviet Union, Finland was never occupied, its democratic institutions were never broken, and its society remained free and independent. The memories of the winter nights, the quiet camaraderie of the trenches, and the resilience of the home front became the foundation upon which the modern nation was built. In the post-war years, the Finnish people worked with the same determination to pay off every single penny of the war reparations, rebuild the ruined towns of Lapland, and transform their country into one of the most prosperous, peaceful, and successful societies in the world. Now, let the echoes of the history fade away. The long journey is complete, the peace is secure, and the world around you is wrapped in the quiet stillness of the northern night. The gentle silence of the Finnish pine forests fills your room. The soft, unmoving waters of the lakes carry away any remaining thoughts. You are safe. You are warm. The darkness is a protective shield, allowing your mind to rest fully. Breathe in the calm night air, let go of the waking world, and slide gently into a deep, peaceful, and restoring sleep. Sleep now. Sleep.